Everyone heard the noise. When Donald Trump threatened a 25% tariff on Canadian goods, the panic was immediate. The headline screamed, "Trade war." The dollar took a hit, and for a moment, it looked like the standard playbook was unfolding again. The U.S. squeezes, and Canada scrambles. But while Ottawa was issuing statements, something else was happening. Something quiet. Detailed plans were moving across desks in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Deals were being signed, not with American partners, but around them. Because here's the reality nobody in Washington was watching. Canada wasn't just preparing a diplomatic response. We were preparing a map change. It's a sinking feeling every Canadian knows. You wake up, check the news, and realize your entire economy is being held hostage by a single tweet from Washington. It makes you angry. But here's the thing about anger. Without a map, it's just noise. And for the first time, Canada found a map. This video isn't about tariff. Tariffs are temporary. This is about a permanent, physical rewiring of North American trade that cuts the U.S. middleman out of the equation entirely. We are talking about a projected shift of nearly $780 billion in trade value over the next decade. We are talking about saving 6 days of transit time to Europe. And most importantly, we are talking about the one thing Washington didn't think we had: options. To understand why this is a checkmate, you have to understand the trap we were in. Look at a map of Canada. You see a massive country. But economically, we are a narrow strip of activity glued to the U.S. border. For generations, we've told ourselves a myth that Canada moves goods east to west. That's not entirely true. If you are a grain farmer in Saskatchewan or a potash miner, your product often doesn't stay in Canada. It dips south. It enters the U.S. rail network, owned by giants like Burlington Northern or CSX, travels to American ports, or uses American logistics hubs before it ever reaches the ocean. Every time that happens, a fee is paid. Billions in transfer fees staying in U.S. pockets. U.S. logistics firms profit from Canadian grain transit not because they grow it, but because they control the gate. We don't just export wheat, we export GDP. It was efficient. It was easy until it became dangerous. Because when you rely on someone else's infrastructure, you inherit their risks. And in 2017, we learned exactly what that risk looks like. The rail line to Churchill, Manitoba, our only deep-water Arctic port, washed out. Massive flooding, 23 breaks in the line. Now that line was owned by a U.S. company, Omnitrax. Logic says you fix it, right? It's a critical lifeline for a Canadian town. But the U.S. owner simply walked away. They looked at the spreadsheet, decided the profit margin wasn't worth the repair cost, and essentially ghosted an entire community. For 18 months, Churchill was cut off. Think about what that actually means. This isn't just about trains not running. This is about families paying $20 for a jug of milk. It's about heating fuel having to be flown in by helicopter. It's about a G7 nation unable to supply its own citizens because a foreign corporation didn't feel like fixing a track. It was a siege by neglect. That moment was a wake-up call that rang from Winnipeg to Ottawa. It proved that foreign ownership of critical infrastructure isn't just an economic issue. It's a national security risk. You cannot rent your sovereignty. That betrayal broke something in the Canadian psyche. And out of that break, a new plan was formed. A plan to buy the line back, to fix it, and to make sure we never had to ask permission to use our own backyard again. Fast forward to March 2025. The line is fixed. The port is owned by the Arctic Gateway Group, a partnership of 41 First Nations and northern communities. That's a great story, but a port without ships is just a pier. You need commerce. You need a reason for the world to come north. Enter Genesis Fertilizers. Genesis is a farmer-owned entity. These are the people actually growing the food, and they were facing a massive problem. Their margins were being eaten alive by logistics. Let's break down the old way so you see why this matters. Historically, nitrogen fertilizer comes from the U.S. Gulf Coast. It travels up the Mississippi, gets on a U.S. train, crosses the border, and finally reaches Saskatchewan. Every mile adds cost. Every transfer adds risk. So Genesis did something radical. They signed a partnership to bypass that entire southern loop. Here is the new math. Instead of railing phosphate up from Florida, they import it directly from global suppliers through Churchill. Instead of sending urea south, they export it through Churchill. Shipping from Churchill to key markets in Europe cuts approximately 6 days off the transit time compared to the St. Lawrence Seaway or going via Vancouver in the Panama Canal. 6 days. That's 6 days less fuel, 6 days less insurance, and critically, 0 days in American jurisdiction. No U.S. rail strikes, no U.S. port congestion, and no U.S. tariffs. This is the Genesis Protocol. It's the proof of concept. And here is why it changes everything. It's not political. It's pure economics. Ask a farmer in Saskatchewan. They don't care about geopolitical chess. They care about margins. If sending wheat north saves $20 a ton, they will send it north. That isn't politics. That's survival. And once money finds a cheaper path, it never goes back. Once Genesis proved the math works, the floodgates opened for the bigger picture. Because if you can move fertilizer, you can move grain. And if you can move grain, you can move potash. And if you can move potash, you can move the most valuable commodities of the 21st century, critical minerals. This is where that massive number comes in. When you add up grain, potash, and minerals, we are looking at a projected cumulative value of nearly $780 billion over the next decade shifting to this corridor. Why so high? Because of what's buried in the Canadian Shield. Manitoba and Saskatchewan are sitting on world-class deposits of lithium, cesium, tantalum, and nickel. These aren't just rocks. These are the ingredients for the electric vehicle revolution, for battery storage, for defense technology. Right now, the logic is to dig them up and ship them south for processing in the U.S. or shipment via U.S. ports. The new logic flips that. Keep them in the north. Process them using clean hydropower in Manitoba. Ship them out the Arctic backdoor directly to battery factories in Germany or markets in Asia. Value added here. Jobs created here. Control kept here. This is the nightmare scenario for those U.S. logistics hubs. They rely on volume. If Canada pulls even 15% or 20% of its agricultural and mineral output out of their network, their margins collapse. Suddenly, Washington isn't the one applying pressure. They're the ones feeling it. So let's go back to that tariff threat. The old Canada would have begged for an exemption. We would have sent a delegation to Washington to plead our case. And sure, we're still doing some diplomacy, but the energy is different now because you can't tariff what you can't touch. If a ton of wheat leaves Saskatchewan, rides a Canadian train on a Canadian track, loads onto a ship at a Canadian port, and sails to Germany, Washington has zero leverage over that transaction. None. That is the difference between trade policy and national strategy. Trade policy is arguing about the price of admission. National strategy is building your own door. And the most powerful thing about this shift, it's permanent. You can repeal a law. You can cancel a treaty, but you cannot repeal a port. Once the concrete is poured, once the cranes are up, and once the supply chains reorient north, they stay north. For too long, we've acted like a tenant in our own house, afraid to upset the landlord. That ends now. This port isn't just concrete and steel. It is the moment Canada stopped asking for permission to trade with the world.